Professor Ingersoll, thank you very much for joining our interview series.
Thank you for having me.
Let me start right away with the first question. The US was founded on principles of religious freedom, yet religion has always played a central role in shaping its political identity. How do you see the tension between secular governance and religious influence in American political history?
That's a really complicated question, which is interesting because most of the discourse about it is very simplified. So you have one faction in the US that says the founding fathers wanted us to have religion in the public square. And then you have another faction who says, no, 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 they were secularists. When in fact, the historical truth is somewhere in between. So the way the Constitution was originally set up, there was no there was no state prohibition on established churches. That the prohibition on the Establishment Clause only applied to the federal government. So in the founding era, there was an assumption that the federal government would be religiously neutral, and it was a compromise between all the different religious communities that were dominant in the different states. But there were state-established churches in that era, and I think the last state to disestablish its churches was Massachusetts in the 19th century. Mm-hmm. So it isn't the case that America's founding was based in religious freedom per se. It was a decentralized system that changed over time, but yeah, so that's part of the reason for the ongoing conflict.
All right. Christian nationalism has been a growing force in American politics. In what ways has it influenced policymaking and public discourse, and how does it compare to early religious movements in American history?
Well, so the conversation about religious nationalism, using that as a label, is relatively recent. So if you go back to the middle of the 20th century, we were talking about the religious right, and then we talked about the new religious right. And that meant that we needed a name for what went before, so we called that the old Christian right. And then there was the Tea Party and the movements. In my view, these movements were just different iterations of the same impulses, but scholars and journalists have given them different names, demarcating them from each other. And I kind of think that's a problem, because we lose the thread that shows that this tension between the way that religion the tension between a secular civil society and a religious civil society, in my view, goes all the way back to the founding era and even pre-founding era. When the Puritans settled New England, they thought they were building a theocracy. They wanted religious freedom for themselves, not for everyone. So again, this tension goes all the way back in American history, and it's replicated in different eras. And we are now calling the side that wants a theocratic, at least theocratically tinged public square, we are now calling them Christian nationalists. But in my view, that's not a new movement.
All right. Many political leaders have framed the US as a divinely chosen nation. How has this religious narrative shaped American foreign and domestic policies over time?
Oh, that's such a huge question, isn't it? I think the most important thing is what Americans have come to call American exceptionalism. When the Puritans built a theocratic New England, this famous phrase that Ronald Reagan popularized, that it was going to be a city on a hill, came from the Puritans. And what the Puritans meant by it is it was going to be the kind of society where everybody around the world would be so impressed that they would emulate it. So they had these kind of expansionist goals from the very beginning. And it was always rooted in this divine right that early Americans believed that they had, and many Americans still do, to shape not only their own communities, but to transfer what they think is God's will to the rest of the world.
Right. Evangelical Christians have been a powerful political bloc, particularly since the late 20th century. What historical factors contributed to their political influence, and how has it evolved in the 21st century?
Again, I have to say, I've been very impressed with your questions. they're rooted in some solid research on the issues at hand, and even in my own work for the purpose of asking me questions. And I appreciate that so much. My book, Building God's Kingdom, traces the rise of today's iteration of theocratic Protestantism. Now, there's a couple other threads that make up the contemporary movement that we're calling Christian nationalism, and we could talk about those. But the Protestant movement itself is rooted in a mid-20th century obscure group called Christian Reconstructionism. And the Christian Reconstructionists had a whole worldview about how the Bible applies to every area of life. And they meant that literally, and they detailed how that would play out in a biblical society. And most theological systems sort of fall by the wayside. You know, most of them most of the ones that have developed across history, we'd have never even heard of, let alone have they taken hold. But what happened with the Christian Reconstructionists is they developed the view that public education was unbiblical and that it should ultimately be dismantled. And in order to make that happen, they developed the Christian school movement, and the foundations of that led to the Christian homeschool movement. So without the Christian Reconstructionists, you wouldn't have had those movements. And those movements spread the obscure group's ideas out to the broader conservative evangelical subculture, because people who've never heard of Christian Reconstructionists often sent their kids to Christian schools. And the Christian Reconstructionist way of thinking about things frames the curriculum that Christian schools promote. And then, of course, a decade or so later, on that foundation developed the Christian homeschool movement. So those two educational movements that are 75 years in the making have shaped this contemporary evangelical understanding of the relationship between church and state and the role of Christians in politics.
Right. Religion has played a dual role in both supporting and resisting social change in America, from abolitionism to civil rights to contemporary issues. How do religious traditions shape activism and policy debates today? Your work especially discusses the rise of effective polarization in American politics. How do religious identity and political affiliation reinforce each other in this dynamic?
So I'm not sure I consider it a rise of effective politics. My approach to the study of religion comes out of social science and even social history rather than theology. So people who approach religion through the study of theology presuppose that theological systems, theologies, ideas come first, and that cultural developments follow that. I, as a social scientist, kind of take a different view. I think culture comes first. And so I don't know, for me, there's no Christianity that exists apart from history and culture. So I don't think you can go back to a time where affective politics wasn't part of what we are now calling religion. I think that's always, I think religions serve to establish social boundaries between different groups and reinforce those boundaries and make people inside those boundaries feel like they have a particularly correct, appropriate, or valuable way of seeing the world over against the people that get put on the outside of those social boundaries. And that's deeply political from the very beginning. So I don't know that that's a change, but it is the case that progressive Christianity has long served as an alternative vision of how religion should engage in politics. Certainly in America, the Black church has had a deeply profound influence in thinking about how religion might engage in the public square. And these are starkly different versions of what Christianity means in the political sphere. The versions between, say, the Black church, the progressive Christians, the socialist Catholics, right? Those groups share certain understandings about how Christianity should engage the public sphere. And that's very distinctly different from how the Christian nationalist, Christian Reconstructionist folks think about how Christianity should shape the public sphere.
Right. Can you please explain the concept of Christian Reconstructionism and Christian nationalism for our audience? Your work traces the ideological influence of Christian Reconstructionism on contemporary politics. What are the key ways in which Reconstructionist theology continues to shape the Christian right today?
So the Christian Reconstructionist movement, and this is what I primarily write about, has its origins in at least probably as early as the 1950s, but certainly the 1960s in the US. The key figure there was R.J. Rushdoony, and he developed a system in which Christians think of the Bible, what they call it as a continuous whole from Genesis to Revelation. So they don't understand there to be a disjuncture between the Old Testament and the New Testament, the way a lot of modern Christians do. And they believe that that Old Testament and New Testament continuous revelation gives us everything that we need to understand how we should live in the world. There are kind of theological structures through which they come to decide what the Bible says about certain things, and we could talk about this if you like, but for some people that's a little too in the weeds. But they do develop a system that speaks to every part of life, and important to that system is the idea that God gave authority to humans in three distinct spheres of life: the church, the family, and the civil government. And that encompasses everything that there is to say about how humans should live, at least for the Christian Reconstructionists. And each of those spheres has distinct tasks and is given distinct authority, and they are not allowed to wade into the authority given to the other spheres. And this becomes really important when they talk about education, because in this conceptualization, education is a task given to families. So the state has no role, no legitimate role in educating children. And this is how they get to the idea that public schools are unbiblical and should be dismantled. It's also how they can say that they believe in a separation of church and state, when for the rest of us, it doesn't look like they do, right? Because for them, the church and the state have separate authority coming from God, and they are given separate tasks. But at the same time, they are under the authority of the Bible. So it's still a theocratic system, even though the church and the state are separate spheres of authority. And that confuses a lot of people. People sometimes think that they're just lying when they say they believe in a separation of church and state. They're not lying. I'm not sure how much work they allow the misunderstanding to do, right? So they can say, oh, we believe in a separation of church and state. And some people will just walk away and say, oh, they say they believe in it, right? Other people will push and say, but that doesn't make sense. And if you push them, you'll see they mean something different by it.
Right. What
Does
roles?
that answer your question?
Yes, indeed.
Okay.
What roles do these two concepts, Christian Reconstructionism and Christian Nationalism, play in the second Trump administration?
Well, it's huge. It's huge. And this is where we can get into a little bit about expanding understanding from Christian Reconstructionism specifically to the kind of broad-based coalition of versions of Christianity that are in power at the moment. So in the movement that we're calling Christian nationalism, you do have a thread that is rooted in a kind of traditional Protestantism, a Calvinist kind of Protestantism, say Presbyterianism, maybe like some early Baptists, or the Christian Reform movement, and that is Christian Reconstruction. But in addition to that, you have a charismatic Pentecostal movement. And for your viewers, listeners who don't know what that is, rooted in the 20th century, there was the rise of a version of Christianity that emphasizes a real spiritual realm that's very literal, with lots of practices that are distinct from other kinds of Christianity. So there's a real emphasis on speaking in tongues, miraculous healing, and those kinds of actions that are described in the Bible, but that most versions of Christianity sort of mythologize. So those are called charismatics and Pentecostals. And about the 1980s, the Christian Reconstructionists started working with the Pentecostals to bring them around to this idea of applying the Bible to every area of life. They called that dominionism. Now that dominionist charismatic Pentecostalism has developed into a movement called the New Apostolic Reformation. And when you see people like Paula White, who's just been made head of the faith office at the, I forget the exact name that they're giving it, but there's a faith-based office in the White House, and Paula White is the director of it. And she comes out of this new apostolic reformation, this charismatic version of Christianity. And it sounds sort of benign, but the way that they think about something like spiritual warfare is a very central concern for them. And by that, they don't mean some kind of struggle against sin, some kind of internal personal struggle, like a lot of Christians might mean. They mean a literal battle where the people around them are divided into God's people and Satan's people. And so it takes on an apocalyptic cast that becomes really important. And so the Christian Reconstructionists and the New Apostolic Reformation have kind of come together on this idea of building a society that's based in the Bible. And they've joined forces with a third form of Christianity in the US that comes out of Catholicism. And it's called the Catholic Integralist movement. And it's a movement that sees the version of Catholicism that you had in the Middle Ages, where the church and state were united under a monarchy. That version of Catholicism you find that present, for example, at the Heritage Foundation, who produced Project 2025. So all three of those groups together kind of share some key components of Christianity, and they have made common cause in what we're calling Christian nationalism. Those components are, for one thing, a kind of theocratic impulse. They all want to have religion be the dominant force in how our society functions. They have different understandings of what that might look like, but they all share that goal. They also share, this is a double negative, but they share a lack of commitment to the concept of democracy. They're fine with democracy if it leads to a kind of religiously based biblical or Christian society, but they're also fine with a monarchy. They're fine with an authoritarian structure. All of that is okay with them if it leads to the right kind of biblical society. And these groups have made common cause over those kinds of things. And they play, as you know, so you've got a faith-based office in the White House that is led by a new apostolic reformation person. You've got the Catholic Integralists that developed Project 2025, that is basically the agenda that the Trump administration is operating with. And you have the Christian Reconstructionists who laid a whole bunch of groundwork over the last 75 years to make this possible. Yeah, I think that answers your question. Yes?
Right, Professor.
Okay.
In the interview you gave to The Guardian on January 24th, you underlined that, and I quote, "When these guys say they believe in the separation of church and state, they are being duplicitous. They do believe in separate spheres for church and state, but also in a theocratic authority that sits above both." End of the quote. Do you mean that Trump and his team do endorse a theocratic authority above democracy? If yes, how much of a danger do these people pose to American democracy and American secularism?
Well, I didn't mean Trump necessarily. I meant the coalition of Christian groups that are behind the Trump administration. Because I think that you do have more secularized versions of political organization that also join into the goals of the Christian nationalists. So let me back up just a little bit. So because I treat religion like a social scientist, I recognize that the categories that we're using to talk about these things are socially, culturally produced. So, for example, the distinctions between the Reconstructionists, the New Apostolic Reformation, and the Catholics, we can think of those as distinct and separate movements with clear-cut boundaries between each other for the purpose of understanding. But in reality, that's not the case. These are fluid movements, and they make common cause where it's useful. The people on the ground are not concerned necessarily about theological consistency, so they'll embrace part of what one of these groups says and let go of the rest of it if it doesn't fit their worldview. So, and likewise, there's not a disjuncture between the groups like these three that we're calling the Christian nationalists as religious groups and other groups that we might not think of as religious, but have some of the same underlying concerns about how society should work. So for example, I think the best example of it these days is the tech bros, the tech bros out of Silicon Valley, right? These folks are not religious per se. They're not connected to Christian nationalism necessarily, but they share underlying views about how society should be ordered. The idea that there are certain people who are more equipped to be leaders and other people who ought to just be followers. They share a commitment to the idea that there's some moral right of people who are equipped to be leaders, taking charge and doing what they think is best. Those tech bros coming out of Silicon Valley are also not committed to an idea of democracy or the commitments to equality that underlie democracy. All three of those religious groups and the tech bros out of Silicon Valley agree that equality is a problematic category. They are not committed to the idea that human beings are equal. And they think that efforts to promote a version of equality in society undermines the strength and power of society. So the lines between the religious groups and the secular groups those lines aren't in reality as clear as we think they are. We talk about them like they're clear, like these are different. And they're different in some ways, but in other ways they aren't different. So in Trump's administration, you have a coalescence of factions of society who don't believe in equality, who aren't committed to democracy, in particular, who in the expressions found in the US believe that white people are superior and also believe that men are superior. So the leaders are you're gonna find that played out in the administration in terms of leadership. Leaders are gonna be mostly white and they're gonna be mostly men. And the goals of undermining are on what has been a commitment to increasing equality in civil society. That's a goal that they don't support. And you see it playing out in international relations too. You know, it comes down to this idea that might makes right. And with Trump's recent conversations about Gaza and about Ukraine and Russia, the underlying thread there is that if you've got the power to take the land, then it's okay, it's moral for you to do so. If you have the power, you have the right to do it. And all of these groups, they might have different ideas about why you have the power. So the Christian ones will say, well, we have the power because God gave it to us. You have other ones that won't say it comes from God. They'll say it comes from a kind of a moral superiority of a certain class of people. But in function, those two views aren't different. They build a society that is colonizing.
Right. In the same interview, you argue that, I quote, so their commitment is to theocracy, the government of civil society according to biblical law and biblical revelation, end of the quote. Can we call this the resurgence of Christian fundamentalism? How do you think fundamentalist Christian groups and other religious movements will be affected by the second Trump administration?
So for me, fundamentalism is a specific movement in Christianity that is tied to a place in time. It's a Protestant Christian movement that originates in the late 19th, early 20th century and has its heyday up through, say, the 1950s. And it's a specific thing. And efforts to kind of argue that there's these fundamentalists, to export that language, to look at groups all across the globe I think is kind of problematic. But if you mean, well, here's another way to think about it. There's a scholar in religious studies whose work I use a lot. I really like. His name is Bruce Lincoln. And he talks about religious movements in terms of how they understand their place in the larger society. And he categorizes them into two groups, minimalist and maximalist. And he says that with the Enlightenment, philosophers were attempting to put a hold on the wars of religion that were happening in Europe. So they thought about making religion kind of in its own sphere and distinct from the rest of society. It was very powerful in a kind of spiritualized personal way, but not in a public way. And he calls the movements that bought that modernist way of thinking about religion, he calls them minimalist. He calls the ones that reject that and say that religion speaks to all areas of life, he calls them maximalist. And I think that's a more helpful category to conceptualize this. So if you think of early fundamentalism in the 20th century in America, they were maximalist. They rejected the ways that minimalism tried to circumscribe the influence of religion as a private personal matter. If you think of certain forms of Islam around the world, certain forms of it are also maximalist, just like the Christian fundamentalists of the 20th century. Other forms of Islam are also minimalist. American Muslims look mostly like every other kind of religious group in the US. And so you have that's a way of making sense of how, well, at my university, we often have interfaith events, and you get a Protestant, a Catholic, a Jew, a Hindu, and a Muslim on the stage, and they're all talking with each other. But it becomes clear really quickly that they have more in common with each other as minimalists than they have in common with their counterparts in the same religious, under the same religious label, the counterparts who are maximalists. So my colleagues at UNF who are Muslims they're minimalist Muslims, and they can talk to the minimalist Jews, but they don't really talk to the maximalist Muslims. And the same happens with the Jews, right? And the Christians and the Hindus actually also. So I think that's a better way to think about the rise of fundamentalism. And I think those categories are, they're less tied to place and time than the language of fundamentalism.
All right. In your article titled Classification Matters, Hiding Violence in Christianity in the US, you argue that since Christianity is a dominant religious tradition in the US, it is the beneficiary of rhetorical structures and classification systems that function to obscure its relationship to violence. In the West, it is usually Islam that's strongly associated with violence. How do you think these classifications shape public perceptions of religious extremism in the US? Can you explain the relationship between violence and Christianity and the dynamics of this relationship?
Well, and so this is great that this question follows the last one, right? Because we're not talking about all Christians. Violence, Christianity in general, if there were such a thing, isn't necessarily violent. But there are forms of Christianity that see the employment of violence as legitimate. Just as there are forms of Islam, Judaism, and Hinduism in particular, but even Buddhism. There are forms of those traditions that legitimate the employment of violence. And by those structures that hide it in the context of a Christian, in the context of the US that is infused with forms of Christianity, the result is at the beginning, in a decade ago, we could readily see, as Americans, we could readily see the Islamic forms of violence around the world. But when a group that is identified with Christianity would enact violence, there wasn't any notion that represented Christianity in general, right? So when Muslims would do something violent, they were associated with all of Islam. When Christians would do something violent, they would be disassociated. Oh, that's an aberrant form of Christianity. Those aren't quote unquote real Christians, right? So those dividing lines that separate the rest of us who are nice people who aren't violent, and I have that in quotes, it was a distancing mechanism so that everyday Americans could look at somebody like Timothy McVeigh, who blew up the federal building in Oklahoma City and killed a bunch of people, including a whole bunch of children. Oh, but he wasn't really a Christian. But yes, he was, right? But he doesn't get identified as a Christian terrorist. He doesn't get identified as a terrorist. He gets identified as a kind of right-wing crazy guy who did this violent act. If Timothy McVeigh had been a Muslim, that would have been Islamic violence attacking us from, like the way it gets framed is shaped by the fact that Americans kind of take for granted a Christian backdrop. and they more easily discern the distinctions between various forms of Christianity than they would with a tradition that is less familiar.
All right.
There are other answers to that question, but yeah, that one could go on for a long time, that question.
And the last question, Professor Ingersoll, in the article From Christian Reconstruction to Christian Nationalism, what the media need to know about the 75-year effort to establish theocracy in the US, you critique how media coverage of Christian nationalism often fails to grasp its long-term influence. What changes would you recommend for journalists covering this topic?
Well, it's interesting the way that you organize this, because this question really brings us back to much earlier in our conversation. In this discussion about Christian nationalism and what it is and how we think about it. Because one of the things that media does, and scholars do it too, scholars who don't root their work in history and don't have a historical sense of the development of things, this systematic renaming of this group of Christians, whatever you call them, the consistent renaming of them about every 10 years, along with so every 10 years it gets renamed, and 5 or 6 years into the 10 years, the reporters say, oh, well, they're gone now. And then a few years later, they're not gone. A few years later, something happens. Often it's an election, and people start recognizing them again, but they do it with a new name. And so that has some advantages. So to talk about evangelicalism, which is the way I used to talk about this, suggests that it's mostly Protestants. So calling it Christian nationalism today expands the way that we see it to include those Catholics and charismatics that we talked about. So there's some good things about it, but the problem with it is it loses that historical trajectory. So the result is we think as a culture that this movement has just arisen out of nowhere. In fact, you even had reporters saying, who could have thought this would happen, right? Well, everybody who is paying attention should know that this could have happened, because they've been trying to do it for at least 75 years, but really longer. And we miss the long-term time horizon with which these people work if what we do is rename them every 10 years and then decide that they have disappeared, and then fail to connect the last version to the new one that arises. And because we have a mistaken idea about the relevant time horizon, we think that we can address this in an election cycle, or we could resolve a certain, so people think, oh, well, if we can just power through the Trump administration for 2 years, we can have a midterm election and we can change it all. We might have a midterm election, I hope we do, and we might be able to change the composition of the 3 branches of government in a way that could make things better. But even if that happens, this doesn't go away. They've been working on this for a long time, and they will continue to work on it. So 2 quick illustrations of that. Project 2025, that is now the blueprint for the Trump administration, didn't come out of nowhere. The Heritage Foundation started doing these. The larger name for it is the Mandate for Leadership. They started it going into the Reagan administration. Every 4 years, they've been doing one of those. Now, this is by far the most comprehensive. They got right to work at the end of the last Trump administration, and the detail with which they built strategies. If you read that document, the detail is overwhelming, right? So this is by far the most coherent version of it, but it's not new. They've been doing it since the late 1970s. Christian Reconstructionists in the homeschool movement, as an example, they have produced a curriculum to send out to homeschool families to teach families to build a 200-year plan for a family dynasty. So they get homeschooling families to sit down at their kitchen table and make a 200-year plan. This is not something we can resolve in 2 years. And I think that what happens, and what I would like the media to recognize, is the long-term character of this, because that's the only way to address it, is to also work long-term.
Professor Ingersoll, thank you so very much for your time.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
I appreciate it.